All right. Thank you, Donna, and thank you for everybody who is attending either now or watching the video later. This slide is a picture of Bishop Falls, where the Ashokan Reservoirs Dam was constructed. And this was a photo that we found in the archives of the Olive Free Library's local history museum that my students and I have helped to open back up again and create new exhibits for. So at the very end of the presentation, I'll be mentioning that people constantly ask me when they'll be able to see Bishop Falls if there's a drought, and they're expecting this to emerge from under the water, but it has yet to do it, and I doubt it ever will, especially given the wood and the conditions of these buildings. So I'm an archaeologist, which means that I'm approaching this New York City reservoir history in a way that is different from how a lot of people have looked at it before. There's a lot of economic analysis, legal analysis, and history analysis where the focus is on generally named people and things like, were they adequately compensated? Whereas from the archaeological perspective, I focus on the landscape and the stories that are held in that landscape, and also groups of people instead of individuals. So I don't list names of politicians or lawyers or engineers, and I don't celebrate the amounts of volumes of land that has been moved and so forth. What I do is I go out in the field with students. These are 4 of my students from about 5 years ago, and we're trying to find the ruins of the places, the homes, the businesses, the churches, the cemeteries that were lost to reservoir construction, both during the initial construction of the reservoir and through the maintenance of the water system over the last 100 years. So there's things being demolished today and places that are being encapsulated by New York City as their land and cut off from these communities. So I'm looking for change over time on the landscape through these sites and through the stories that are held there. So as Don and I were talking about right before the presentation began, I'm going to be traveling a bit through the reservoir system this summer with some of my research assistants again. And we're looking to go to places that we haven't gone to before. We haven't looked at ROUNDOUT or NEVERSINK yet, and the ruins that are there. So this is a map that shows all the black dots with the white around them are building locations from the 1900 United States Geological Survey map, with the red dots being churches and the one purple dot there being a cemetery. And you could see that in my maps, I include these locations of ruins of the water system outside the water take line. And these are on properties that New York City owns and runs as recreation land. So, going too fast here. So doing the same thing for the NEVERSINK reservoir and showing you on the image on the right, the orange, all of that is New York City owned land. So I do my research not just on what was demolished for the reservoir, but what keeps getting demolished, what keeps getting taken in order to protect the water for New York City. So I'm going to talk to you about mostly the town of Olive and the town of Kent, each that has its own reservoir. In Olive, you have the Ashokan Reservoir, which actually straddles the town of Olive and Hurley, but I'm only focusing on Olive. I use towns as my unit of analysis to help organize it. Otherwise, when do you know when to stop, and when does one reservoir impact the next community? And in the town of Kent, you have the BOYDS Corner Reservoir. And both of these are part of this watershed system that flows into New York City, which is the orange on the map on the left. So my overarching question for my research is, what are the long-term impacts of reservoir creation and maintenance? So not to keep you in suspense, here are some of my conclusions right from the beginning so that you could then see the evidence that I have for this and critique the evidence as we go along. In both the towns of Olive and the town of Kent, New York City became the majority landowner. And this seems independent of the size of the reservoir, whereas Kent's reservoir is only 1.7 billion gallons and Olive's is 123 billion gallons. The size of the reservoir has no impact on how much of the majority of the land that the city has gained in both towns. It's independent of the year of service. So the Boyd's Corner Reservoir went into service in 1873, the Ashokan in 1915, and it's independent of the distance from New York City, Boyd's Corner being 40 miles from the city at its closest point, and the Ashokan being 75 miles at its closest point. So you could start seeing why I'm interested in going to more reservoirs to see if this pattern holds up or if it differs when you get further away, say, or if you get more recent in time period. Along with the city becoming the majority landowner in both towns, the economy of both towns changed. New York City and New York State instituted rules for water protection after the reservoirs went in, which redefined how the towns can be run. There was also a redirection of water, roads, and railroads that changed the economic potential of locations. And both of these changed the land values, which led to a change in the landowners. So how we tabulate the impact of these reservoirs is often done through the city's own statistics. The diagram on the left being from one of the engineering reports that says how much volume of land was moved for the ROUNDOUT and the NEVERSINK and the Pepacton. There's another page for the other reservoirs. And I tabulated all of this in the table to the right, where I could only find from New York City's records their impacts as far as communities destroyed, populations homeless, bodies reburied, and land taken for only these reservoirs. But there are 19 reservoirs in the system. So this summer, one of my research assistants is going to be specifically dedicated to trying to get, for the first time ever, a complete tally of the number of buildings demolished to create the New York City reservoir for all 19 reservoirs and controlled lakes. So I'm going to start by giving you my summary of my research on the Boyd's Corner Reservoir, and then I'm going to pause for a few minutes to see if there's any questions specific to the Boyd's Corner Reservoir and the town of Kent before I give you information on the Ashokan Reservoir and the town of Olive. And then when they're both done, we could talk about both, or we could talk about how this might be reflected in the reservoirs that are closer to where you might live. So the Boyd's Corner Reservoir is on the West Branch River in Putnam County. It's illustrated in this map in red. This map is a digitized version or redrawn into a computer version of the 1867 Beers Atlas, where every little house is a building and each building with its associated name on that atlas map. Even though the Boyd's Corner Reservoir was going to go on the West Branch River, New York City was keenly interested in the water coming from White Pond, the blue water body in the upper right-hand corner. And this White Pond is a spring-fed pond that flowed through this community of farmers' mills, which included a variety of mills, including a whiskey mill, a whiskey distillery, some blacksmith shops, some schools, and so forth. And then the water flowed down into what was going to become the Boyd's Corner Reservoir. So this Boyd's Corner started around 1867, the plan for it. But in 1864, there was a newspaper article about White Pond and farmers' mills that kind of foreshadowed what was about to happen. So reading this here for you, it said, Farmers' Mills is situated in the lap of several small hills on the northwest portion of the town of Kent and is a village of much notoriety. It has the most beautiful and healthy streams of water running through its center known in the state of New York, capable of driving the machinery of any manufactory for which the water is used. And yet it is strange to say that its location has never been sought and obtained by capitalists of this go-ahead and prosperous county. So within 4 years, people did acquire White Pond and Farmers Mills as part of creating the Boyd's Corner Reservoir. So if you just look at the reservoir, New York City acquired 420 acres for the Boyd's Corner Reservoir, and that by itself added 270 million gallons to the city's supply. But as soon as they did that, there was a drought in the region and New York City was growing. So New York City said, it's not enough. So they started putting other Kent ponds into service and started shunting the Kent Pond water into the Boyd's Corner Reservoir. And then they acquired White Pond and Farmers Mills. And the acquisition information describes it as the city's work to get these properties as a combination of condemnation, sale, and absorption, that they drove away residents and business owners because they prevented them from using the water or doing anything within any vicinity of the water. So it's not just the 420 acres, it was this entire region that they started taking over to get their reservoir to be useful to them. So this is the same map, just showing slightly different information. Instead of those little houses showing the building locations, the center dot is a building location, and the shaded dot around it, the circle around it, is an 850-foot barrier or buffer zone around each building, showing 850 feet around a building and its relationship to a stream. This is because in 1893, New York City was allowed to abate all nuisances, including the use of water in farmers' mills. They literally sent people to the town of Kent to stop people from doing things like having outhouses anywhere near the water, having animals anywhere near the water. They forced people to be dug out of graves because they were near the water. And in 1899, the New York State Board of Health said that the city could eliminate all farms within 800 feet of a water body that flowed into the Boyd's Corner Reservoir. So for this image, you can see that pretty much every single building, which doesn't represent the entirety of a farm, is within 800 feet of a water body. So within 50 years of creating the Boyd's Corner Reservoir, farming essentially became illegal in the town. With this change in the ownership, so Mildred is singing to you if you could hear it. Mildred Bailey was a blues singer who moved into the town of Kent, along with all of these other elite people who wanted to be near New York City, but wanted to have a country home. So as these farmers can no longer farm, their farms are condemned, the property values plummeted, and many elite people like Mildred Bailey and other people who worked in New York City purchased the land of Kent and turned these farms into country estates. The same year that Mildred moved to Kent, she released this song, "It's So Peaceful in the Country. It's so simple and quiet, you really ought to try it." And this is part of this movement that it was created, that Kent is open for city residents to have this rural homestead. So Boyd's Corner Reservoir was really just a beginning of the city's influence on the town of Kent. This map shows again those locations of the buildings from 1867, but the dark green is every property that is now owned and operated by New York City as a recreation property. So you can see potentially that there isn't much left in between that isn't a steeply sloped hill going up or a water body. So with all of this recreation land that New York City has purchased, a lot of it since 1990, to help protect the water that flows into the Boyd's Corner Reservoir, but also the blue water body at the bottom there is the top of the West Branch Reservoir that was built a few years after the Boyd's Corner Reservoir. New York City owns and operates 15% of Kent's town land as city recreation areas. So this is 10 times the original land taking over from 1867 to 2020 that the city has created their land use in the town of Kent. So as an archaeologist, I go to these city-owned recreation properties, only the ones that are open for hiking, and I hike them with my students and sometimes with community members, and we look for the ruins of these farms and businesses that might remain on the landscape. And whereas in the past this was rolling meadow, this is now dense forest. So a lot of people don't realize that there are ruins of farms in the woods, or they don't believe that these ruins in the woods are associated with farms because they believe the forest has always been there. So the red arrows point to 3 different New York City recreation units, Kent Hills in the top right, Boyd's Corner North and the left top, and Boyd's Corner South on the bottom, that I'm going to bring you to very briefly and show you some of the archaeology that is there on the ground surface. We never disturb the soil and we never collect any artifacts, so everything that we see is still there for somebody else to see. So this is the Boyd's Corner North unit, so the Boyd's Corner Reservoir just peeking in at the bottom. And if you could see on this New York City distributed recreation map, towards the center is a little brown square and the letters CEM. They identified that there is a cemetery in the middle of their recreation unit. So this is the first place that I brought students to when we started doing the archaeology of the New York City water system. And there's no obvious way to get there because there are no trails on these hiking recreational properties. So the image on the left shows this green line, which is the path that the students and I took to get to the cemetery. And the southernmost point is we got to the cemetery and then we had to hike back out. It was a very, very rough hike. This is a very lots of boulders on this very steep slope. And the students who went with me that day never ever went with me anywhere again. I think they were that exhausted from this hike to get to this cemetery. So when we got to the cemetery, we were surprised to see that a brand new marker had just gone up in the same year in 2012, identifying this as the Parker Farm plot, the Parker Farm Cemetery. Other farm associated things are on that unit, including a water pump on the left, a brick in the top right, DPBW is the Dennings Point Brickworks, and one of these stone chambers that I'm going to mention a little later that are essentially root cellars that are always associated with farm structures. With this one is next to that water pump. In the cemetery, we found the grave of Elsa Lee. And in the 1867 map, right next to the cemetery, it shows Mrs. Elsa Lee Parker's house, right? And you notice that there is no water body to the north of Mrs. Parker's house and cemetery. Whereas if I go back, you see this water body, Seven Hills Lake. That is also a man-made water body that was not there during the agricultural history of this area. In the top right is the foundation of Mrs. Parker's house. And I'm in the middle of the foundation with Jackie, who is a member of the Kent Historical Society. And we're talking about what it was like for the Lee and Robinson families to have lived on this property. And on the bottom there is a picture of a ceramic sherd of a jug, just one of the many artifacts that are there on the ground surface. So to bring you to the Kent Hills Recreation Unit that was all the way to the east in the town of Kent, this New York City distributed map doesn't show any reason why you would want to go there. There's no cemetery in the center. There's no hiking. It says you could fish on this property, but those little blue lines, it's dry 90% of the time. There's no fish on this property. But throughout the Kent Hills Recreation Unit are very impressive, well-built stone walls in an elaborate setup with barbed wire and springs from gates. This was a dairy farm, a very extensive dairy farm that was owned by the Kent family of the town of Kent, David Kent's family. So we document the ruins of both of these farms, Elsa Parker's farm and David Kent's farm, in the field, and then we compare it to the census records. So the 1860s census shows that Elsa Parker and David Kent were almost the same age, but David Kent had 10 times the value of real estate. And whereas Elsa had just 3 horses, 6 cows, 4 sheep, and 6 pigs, David Kent had 7 horses, 80 cows, 30 sheep, and 18 pigs. The important thing to see here is it really didn't matter how wealthy or successful you were. Once New York City was taking the water from the town of Kent, both of these families lost their farms, and their farms are now city-owned properties with very little known about their histories. So the last Kent property I'm going to take you to is the Boyd's Corner South unit, which this is the map again from the city showing no reason why you would want to recreate there. And to get onto this property from the main road, it is a very steep slope that you have to climb up. The students and I got halfway up the slope, recording farm elements the whole way, gates, stone walls, all sorts of artifacts, that we got almost to the top. And I said, you know, it's lunchtime, but there's going to be a ruin of a mansion at the top of the hill. Do you want to go back down and have lunch, or do you want to keep going to the top? And of course they said, let's go to the ruin of a mansion and eat lunch later. So we got to the top and we started seeing bricks again, which was leading us to the ruins of this mansion, the 1906 Kittredge Mansion, which had 50 rooms in it. Is at the top of the hill on this city-owned recreation property. Here are some steps associated with it and the rose garden that was behind the house that still blooms, even though this is considered virgin land and wilderness that have been untouched by human hands. There's a lovely landscaped rose garden there. So this property, before it had the Kittredge Mansion on it in the 1860 census, was the farm of William Hopkins, who was a 41-year-old farmer, so younger than the Parker and Kent families. He was kind of in between them with $5,000 in real estate. In 1906, the Kittredge family purchased this property after the Boyd's Corner Reservoir had been put in and it could no longer be used as a farm. And they were winemakers. So they built this 50-room mansion. They had servants and everything. But in the 1920s, they sold their mansion and it became the Carmel Country Club. There's a 1928 New York Times article about the country club and other properties in Kent being turned into resorts and country clubs for more wealthy people. And in that New York Times article, they called this property virgin forest that was carefully and scientifically preserved, when it's actually the remnants of William Hopkins' farm and has also the remnants of this Kittredge family's country estate on it. So there's nothing virgin forest about this land. So to kind of summarize up Boyd's Corner Reservoir, which, you know, 5 years of research summarized in like 6 slides, in 1867, New York City acquires 400 acres of land to build one reservoir. By 2019, New York City has that, but they also have 4,000 acres of Kent land that is owned and controlled by New York City. Through this condemnation of farming across the town, there's an almost total replacement of the original population. And that has led to a lot of mythology about these ruins, that people are sure that these can't be farms. This is a New York Times article from April 22nd of 2001. And in the bottom, in a little box there, I have summarized or highlighted an important point of this article that says, in fact, this chamber, the stone chambers like the one on Elsa Parker's property that I showed you, tucked away in the woods of Putnam County, resembles the Neolithic stone monuments of the ancient Celts. So do the roughly 100 similar stone chambers in Putnam. So there's such a disconnect from the farm history to the forests and reservoirs that are there today, that even the New York Times helps to propagate the idea that these are from a lost civilization instead of from the communities who lost their properties to the New York City reservoir system. So I'm going to stop for a minute and see if there's maybe 1 or 2 questions about Kent that we could address, or if you guys are ready to go into Olive and the Ashokan Reservoir, we could do that.
I did mute everybody upon entry, so you'd have to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. April, this is fascinating to me.
So, Dr. Beer, so what happened to the mansion?
So the mansion was, it stayed until the 1980s, and it was the clubhouse for what is now known as the Sedgwick Club, which is a elite residential compound that advertises that they are among virgin forest and adjacent to land that will never be built upon. So they get the people who own these houses in the Sedgwick Club there. So it was demolished in 1980s after a suspicious fire ravaged the mansion.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We'll get back to it, and keep thinking if you have any questions, we could address them later. So this is the Ashokan Reservoir, and this illustration is very important. Archaeologists spend a lot of time looking at things above ground and below ground, and other people don't necessarily look at things that way. I was on a plane flying into Newburgh Airport, and the person next to me pointed this out, and she called it something. She was like, "Oh, there's Lake Erie," and I'm like, "No, that's not Lake Erie," right? I'm so used to seeing it from above. But if you look in the top, you'll see that the top of the map shows both Mount Tremper and Woodstock, and these are important landmarks to see the next map. So the Ashokan Reservoir is a large reservoir on the west side of the Hudson River that was functional in 1915. It currently has 123 billion gallon capacity. There's a plan to raise the dam to increase the capacity. They say it's just in case of storms because of climate change. And they also say that it won't actually make the reservoir bigger. But I'm not sure how you could increase capacity and not make something bigger. The geometry of that doesn't make sense to me. The Ashokan Reservoir alone supplies 40% of New York City's water. And at its closest point, it's 75 miles northwest of New York City. So keep this map in mind for a second, keep where Mount Tremper and Woodstock is in mind for a second, because I'm going to show you a map of this area from before the reservoir. So, here we go. Here's the same place from before the reservoir. Find Woodstock and Mount Tremper at the top. The little red box, that was the largest body of water before the Ashokan Reservoir in this same place. It was only 100 acres. So let me go back. So after New York City, before New York City. Right. So where this red line is, that was the railroad that came through all of these little communities on its way to Kingston. So before the Ashokan Reservoir, the largest body of water was this Temple Pond. The railroad was the economic engine of life. And these hamlets that you might have heard of and seen signs for the former site of around the Ashokan Reservoir were mainly train stops or post office locations. This is important for when people say how many towns were demolished or how many villages were demolished. It's hard to count because sometimes the name of a location is just a post office or a railroad stop. So this is a map from a travel brochure before the reservoir went in. So where the reservoir went in is in the yellow box, advertising the travel that you could have through the town of Olive to get into the Catskills. So upgrades to the railroad system by 1870 made the Ulster and Delaware Railroad so popular that the town of Olive became known as the gateway to the Catskills. There's an article in Harper's Weekly Magazine about Olive as the gateway to the Catskills. By 1882, 70,000 visitors, according to the Ulster and Delaware Railroad, were using their railroad to tour the Catskill region. And a round-trip ticket from New York City to the town of Olive cost $5, which with inflation is the equivalent of $165 today. So people were going on this railroad to get to some of the main resorts like those in Woodstock and Phoenicia, the color image being the Woodstock Overlook Mountain House, whose ruins you could go to today. And the bottom picture being the Tremper House that burned down and was rebuilt several times. So this is just one iteration of it. But within the town of Olive, you could stay at a farmhouse. There were some smaller resorts that were bigger than a farmhouse, but a lot of farmhouses would open up their doors in the summer travel season, and they would allow boarders to come in, and they charge between $5 a week and $4 a day. So you remember $5 is $165 today's money. So they were making good money, Olive residents, from the railroad bringing in tourists. And families would have multiple boarding houses. So this is a postcard of the Winchell farmhouse in ASHOKAN. And from the Ferris 1897 travel guide, Hiram Winchell in Brown Station also had a boarding house with room for 30. Isaac Winchell in the hamlet of Olive, that's in the town of Olive, very confusing, had room for 10 boarders, and A.B. Winchell had room for 25. So if you do the math, they're charging $5 a week per person. They've got room for 30. $5 is $165. They're making good money, allowing city residents to experience country living. Okay. So this is a postcard of the ASHOKAN railroad station. So before the reservoir went in, this railroad and this tourist economy was the backbone of the economy in the town of Olive. In an 1883 travel guide, all of the boarding houses in the town of Hurley totaled room for 145. All the boarding houses in Woodstock totaled 506 accommodations. Wow. And in Olive, they had room for 1,207 people. So here is a chart showing by town, Hurley, Woodstock, Olive, and then Shandaken, how many boarders they could take in the years. The dark blue is 1883, the red is 1903, the tan is 1906, which is the year construction started for the Ashokan Reservoir. The lighter blue is 1910, and then the kind of rust color is 1914, when evacuation of the town of Olive, where the reservoir was going in, would be complete. So you could see that between 1883 and 1914, Olive always had more boarding houses and boarding house accommodations than any of the surrounding towns because the railroad went through it. And right when the reservoir construction began, they could accommodate 2,366 boarders. That dropped down because they demolished the railroad, they took away the boarding houses, they rerouted roads. Even if your house wasn't taken, if your boarding house wasn't taken, people couldn't get to you. So this is part of the collateral damage of the people outside the reservoir take line still lost their economy as well. But even when you drop down to 1914, it shows that there's just about 750 rooms. And I think some of them were people who are still being optimistic that the city wasn't going to take their property instead of the actual number of rooms that were used that year. So this is a postcard from right before the reservoir went in. So you're looking across the reservoir to the northwest at the hamlet of ASHOKAN. And in one of these travel guides, the Ferris travel guide, the Ferris travel guide from 1897, and Ferris is an interesting travel guide because he lived in the town of Olive, the guy who wrote it. He said, nowhere else in the Catskills but Olive does the peaceful level of wide meadow, the foreground of this postcard, combine so delightfully with the uplifted slopes of high mountains. It is no wonder that hundreds of city folks come here year after year for the season of rest. So it's this beautiful view that people are coming for. And you can see all that stuff going on in the middle there. Those are buildings. This is a dense occupation, this hamlet of ASHOKAN. So I used Google Earth to try to recreate this image today, the best I can, given the technology and the fact that I would have to actually be in the water of the reservoir to recreate this image. But this is what that same landscape looks like today. And it's important to show you here that most of the hamlet of ASHOKAN is not under the water. It would have been on the land that's just above that sand there. But because New York City took a buffer of land around the reservoirs, much greater than it did in Boyd's Corner, there's nothing there. But if you walk on the Ashokan rail trail that just went in a couple of years ago, that goes along the north side of the Ashokan Reservoir, you are literally walking on the land of that hamlet of ASHOKAN. It's not under the water, it's on the land. So this is a digitized version of the 1875 map of the town of Olive, where every orange circle is a building. The black dashed line that comes in from the left and goes out the top of the red square is the railroad. The blue that goes through the red square is the Esopus Creek, and the white are the roadways that linked everything together. Everything in that red box was impacted by creation of the reservoir. The bottom image is the same thing, showing the light pink is the water of the Ashokan Reservoir, and the dark red is the buffer of land that has been taken to also protect the water, so that they didn't have to kick people out like they had to kick people out in Kent. So you can see the extent of the destruction across the landscape, that there's very little left in the town of Kent that isn't either disconnected from the rest of Kent or not being able to have that same artery as the water system, the road system, or the railroad system. So when the reservoir went in, there was a 70% loss in the tourist boarding house economy, but also impacts the river, railroad, and major east-west roads. And these created hardships for all those whose land was not taken. So I also digitized the land takings maps. So this orange hatchwork is all of the properties that on my map, you could individually click on a property and find out who owned that property. So when you put all of my maps together, you could start to see a story in a very different way that's been done before. The red apples are all of the schools that have ever existed around the town of Olive in the Ashokan area. So you can see there are several red apples or several schools that were lost. 6 of them in the town of Olive by itself, not counting the losses in the town of Hurley. The churches are the crosses. There were 6 churches that were lost to the reservoir construction. And the little tombstones are cemeteries. Over 2,800 dead were removed from cemeteries for the creation of the Ashokan Reservoir. And you can see that this extends well far out from where the water body ends. I made a version of this map that now hangs in the Olive Free Library's local history museum, and it's 4 foot by 4 foot, so people could look at it and really analyze it. And the key on the left is every family name. So you could find each family and see what land was taken from them. And when I did this, to me, most interesting thing that came out of this is that from these circa 1906 land takings, 23% of the land takings were women-owned properties. Most people think that women didn't own property in 1906, and women owned a lot of property in the town of Olive. The women-owned properties alone averaged 15.5 acres per property, but they totaled 1,705 acres. So when it comes to thinking about compensation, how easy was it for an independent landowning woman to take whatever little money they got from New York City and recreate what they had somewhere else, right? That's a question I can't answer, right? The largest women-owned parcels included Mary Cole's parcel that was 120 acres. So it wasn't just that women owned small parcels, women owned parcels of all sizes. But when I created a map that just shows the women-owned properties, where here the purple at the top is the current rail trail location or the relocated Ulster and Delaware Railroad, the black railroad is the original railroad location, you could see that most women-owned properties were adjacent to other women-owned.
April, we can't hear you.
What happened?
Don't know.
It doesn't say that I'm muted. Let me stop sharing. Can you hear me now?
Definitely.
All right, let's try sharing again. Where did I lose you? Should I pick up where I was on here?
We're talking about the women-owned property being adjacent to other women-owned properties.
Okay. So the women-owned properties were adjacent to other women-owned properties, but they were also adjacent to the railroad and to schools and churches. They tended to be downtown. A lot of them also tended to be very small properties on which they had businesses. So New York City didn't compensate people for business loss. They compensated people for the real estate value of their land. So here's an example from Bob Studing's book, The Last of the Handmade Dams, that you might have already seen and read, where I could take the story that he has taken from the legal history and add it to the maps. So you could see kind of the archaeology of this story. So this story is about Tina Krantz Lasher, who was a widow. So here I'm showing you the current water body in blue, which is on top of the current land, the green, where the bridge goes over the Ashokan Reservoir in the center. So all of the roads in the bottom right, that's the New York City compound that exists there now. The black is the railroad that was demolished, and the blue is showing where the Esopus Creek originally went to. So the orange is women-owned properties that Tina Lasher's property, Tina's property being in yellow to highlight it, showing that she was living around all of these other women-owned properties, but also showing that her land was taken not to be submerged, but her land was taken to build the New York City compound. Right? And this is in the hamlet of Brown Station, which is the only hamlet taken around the Ashokan Reservoir that doesn't have one of those former site of signs. So Tina Lasher's only income was her boarding house. She charged $6 a week per person plus meals. So approximately $200 a week per person. She could take 10 to 15 boarders at $100 a week as her income. So she was making in 2021 dollars about $2,500 a week with her boarding house that was adjacent to the railroad. When New York City took her land, she claimed a $10,000 loss of income. The city refused to give her that money for her lost income, and they paid her instead $1,445, and this money arrived after she died and was given to her heirs. So Tina Lasher was not compensated, and that brings up the question of, could she have, if she hadn't have died, recreated her business elsewhere, especially not having been bought out of her business adequately. One of the other things that I've done is I've gone to all of the local cemeteries and I've looked for the graves of the people who were impacted by the creation of the New York City Reservoir or moved by them, from one cemetery being demolished into the other. And one of the people who I was able to find is John Boyce, who owned a grist mill at Bishop Falls. So the map in the bottom is the Bishop Falls area right at the dam that you could park at the Ashokan Reservoir. He sought $300,000 in lost business from the city, and he was awarded $112,000, which was the largest of any olive landowner, according to Bob Studing. And John Boyce is buried in the Tongor Cemetery. So this is an example of how even the cemeteries contain these stories of the Ashokan Reservoir. John Boyce is a great example of the cumulative losses of family members and the generational wealth that was lost by families across Olive and across the reservoir landscape. If you just look at the Boyce surname on the land taking maps, Boyce surname people lost 28 parcels for a total of 470 acres. And if you look at surnames by themselves, 5 family names are repeated over and over, that just 5 families lost 75 parcels and 1,354 acres. So this map shows in purple all the Boyce family properties that were taken by New York City in 1906. There were also people who lost their jobs that were water-powered jobs from outside the reservoir. When the Esopus was no longer flowing, things like the pulp mills were shut down. I found 2 postcards of this pulp mills that were sent in 1906, right before the reservoir went in. And in one, it says, "Dear Hattie, I suppose this will be gone when the waterworks comes. Yours, Martin." So even people who didn't own land lost a lot when the reservoir came in. Some of the places that were lost seem like empty land. There weren't buildings on maps for it, but this includes places like Crispell's Grove at West Shokan that had a pavilion capable of holding 1,000 persons in case of a storm, where they used to have church and school functions. This also was lost to the reservoir. So if you didn't lose your property, you might have lost your school, your church, your fairgrounds, your business, the source of people for your business, the place that you worked. All of these other losses need to be accounted for. So like in Kent doing the archaeology, when we go to these properties, this is the New York City owned Black Road property, which is just north of the Ashokan Reservoir. You can see that there's these really huge stone walls. There aren't stone walls bigger than this anywhere else that we've surveyed, and they go on for miles. And the interesting thing about this property is that none of the historic maps show any individuals living here or any farms here, even though we also have building foundations on this property. So I think what this is evidence of is that when people lost their land, a lot of people wanted to stay in Olive because they had all these family connections, and they tried to move up the slope, right? The valley floor was taken, the slope was still there. Even though I've done presentations with historical societies and lots of knowledgeable people, nobody has been able to tell me whose farm this was on Black Road. And I think it's because it was so hard for them to reestablish that they didn't stay there long. And that's why they never appear on maps before or after. So this idea of repurposing the slopes is something that continues today. The red here is all of the New York City owned recreation lands around the Ashokan Reservoir. And the yellow is the current flood buyout program, where New York City is buying properties because this area flooded during the last storms. And this building here is the Boyce Schoolhouse, the Boyceville Schoolhouse, that was built in 1913 to replace the Boyceville Schoolhouse that New York City demolished to create the reservoir in 1906. So this is the schoolhouse that replaced the city's demolished schoolhouse. And just this past year, the city demolished this schoolhouse. So the city demolished the Boyceville Schoolhouse twice over 100 years of time span. So these recreation units around the Ashokan Reservoir, a lot of them are actually completely inaccessible. This one, the Ashokan Brook unit, which is just north of the rail trail in between 2 houses, it is completely impenetrable. I'm a very determined person who has a lot of hiking experience, and I can't get through. This is the entrance, the picture. That is the entrance to this hiking property. I don't know why anybody would go into this hiking property when you can't actually get through it, because there's all these thorns and brambles and dense trees, and there's nothing there once you get there. There's no trails, there's no picnic tables, there's nothing. But it literally says on the map, it's a public access area. but you can't access it. The city properties are also creating inaccessible heritage. This is Elias Elmendorf's grave. There's a small Elmendorf cemetery that is behind these no trespassing signs. This isn't open for hiking. It's just no trespassing at all. And there are trees that have come down that are knocking over these gravestones in this cemetery, but my students and I aren't allowed in there to help this cemetery because it's no trespassing with no questions asked. So to wrap up the Olive and Ashokan Reservoir, in 1906, New York City took 4,000 acres of land. By 2019, they've taken an additional 5,500 acres to create this city-owned recreation units. They own additional land, but they haven't turned them into recreation units at this point. The difference between Olive and the Ashokan and Kent and Boyd's Corner is that Olive, many descendants remain, and they know the histories of their families. But telling their histories is complicated by the lack of persistent landmarks. A lot of the communities moved and they kept the same name for their community. So when you talk about Shokan, which Shokan are you talking about? But this is an article from 2015 from the internet that lists Olive among the 10 drowned towns that you can visit. And it says some claim that when water levels are low in the reservoir, the tops of churches, schools, barns, and orchards drowned by the creation of the Ashokan can still be seen. So clearly people don't understand how buildings decompose. During a major drought in 2002, building foundations and old wells were revealed. Direct access to the reservoir has been limited since 9/11, but you could still catch a glimpse of the structures from nearby bridges. So I went to the reservoir when there was a 57% reservoir drought, and I walked the nearby bridges and looked to see if this web article was lying. And there's no remains of any of these buildings that you could see from bridges, right? That's what the article said. There are remains in the woods especially, but even when the Ashokan Reservoir is 57% drought, you cannot see the Bishop Falls that was on that first slide for the opening, which should be right there, right next to the dam. So my maps allow us to match that location. So to wrap up, my conclusions from my research are that urban water systems come with significant costs to outlying communities. Taking water changes places and its people, and where what happened is not understood, mythology fills in the gaps to make sense of it all.